In Visual Studio 2015, I happen to be using Enterprise, but you could be using Professional, Community, or you could also use Visual Studio 2015 Express for Windows. And we're going to build a simple map application. So the first thing we'll do is create a new project. And I'm going to be using C#. And I go to the Windows node, and under Universal, I select blank app. And I'm going to call this My Map App. Click OK, and Visual Studio creates the project for us. Now this project's going to be based on C# and XAML. And XAML is Extensible Application Markup Language, and it serves the same purpose as HTML. It's just instructions to the rendering engine how to draw the page at runtime. And XAML uses what looks like XML. So if you've used Windows Presentation Foundation or Silverlight, then you're familiar with XAML. And the XAML in Windows 10 is very similar to those. So let's open the main page, and let's start building the UI. Now there's a couple ways you can lay out Visual Studio here. What I like to do is have the designer on the left and the XAML on the right, so I can, as I'm building the page, see both the XAML and the designer. But we're dealing with limited screen real estate here, so I'm going to collapse that pane, and I'll be able to switch back and forth between the XAML and the design. So the first thing I want to do in this application is build some navigation scaffolding. I want to build a navigation pane. Let me show you why. Let's switch over to the weather app, and you're probably familiar with this design pattern from Windows 10 applications. We have our icons over here that tell us what we can navigate to, and then this button here, which is lovingly known as the hamburger button. When I click that, the navigation pane opens and shows me what I can navigate to. So we start off on forecast, we can go to maps, we can go to historical weather. So this type of navigation pattern, the navigation pane, is what I want to use in our app. And we're going to need to make a couple controls. We'll use a split view control, which contains the actual navigation, and then we'll create the hamburger button. So let's come over into Visual Studio, and the first thing we're going to do is add a split view. And the split view is a navigation control, and it has the ability to adapt its design to optimize the screen real estate. So we'll name it My Split View, and we're going to say that by default it's open when the app starts, and then we're going to set the display mode to inline. There's a couple choices here. There's actually 4 of them. There's inline, which means the pane's always visible and doesn't overlay the rest of the content on the page. You can have it overlay, and then you have a couple options for compact. We're going to play around with these later. So right now we'll just say display mode's inline and the pane is open. Now next we need to add the navigation items. And so we're going to use the pane of the split view for that. So let's add this XAML. So we have a split view pane which contains a stack panel, and in that are a bunch of radio buttons, and the radio buttons tell us what we can navigate to, and then when you click on them, we're going to run some code. So in order to build the application, we actually need these event handlers to exist. So I'll right-click on radio button pane item underscore click, go to definition. We're not going to write the code for this yet, but we do actually need the event handlers to exist. Okay, if we go and look at the design, we can see what we have. Here's the navigation. We have these radio buttons. We're going to get rid of those in a second. Icons, and then the text. Then the next thing we need is the hamburger button. The split view control doesn't come with a hamburger button, so we'll need to create that separately. We'll go back to the XAML. And below the split view, we will add a button. We're going to call it hamburger button, and it's just going to consist of a bunch of rectangles. And when we click the button, we want the pane to open and close. So we'll right-click on that, go to definition, and then add some code to this. And that code is here. So when we click the hamburger button, if the pane's open, we close it. If it's closed, we open it. And again, we can go back into design and see that now we have our hamburger button right here. So let's run the application and see what it looks like. Pops up in a window. And we can see our split view control with our navigation pane and the hamburger button, and as we asked it to be, it defaults to being open. Now unfortunately, the hamburger button right now is hidden by this black rectangle. This black rectangle is actually giving us useful information. It's showing us the frame rate and the per frame CPU counters. This is very useful when you're performance testing your application. At the moment, we don't really need this, so let's get rid of it. Let's close the application. Come back into Visual Studio. We'll go to app.xaml.cs and scroll down. This is the line of code right here that turns on the frame rate counter. We'll just comment it out. While we're at it, let's get rid of those circles around the radio buttons. I don't really want these. I just want the icon and the text. So I'm going to go into app.xaml and add a style. And so this XAML here says for the radio button, change a couple properties, and that will get rid of the radio buttons. Okay, let's run this and now see what happens. We run the application, and now the radio buttons are gone, the frame rate counter's gone, and by default the pane is open. If I click the hamburger button, this appears and disappears. And what we could do in a real live application is add some visual appeal so it kind of fades out and fades in instead of appearing and disappearing. We'll leave that for version 2 of the application. Okay, let's come back into Visual Studio. Let's continue building this out. I'm going to switch over to the XAML again. When we click Map or any of the other options, we want pages to appear. And so we need a place for the app's content. We're going to use a frame. So underneath the split view pane, but inside the split view, I'm going to add a frame which will be called main frame. Okay? So now what we want to do is wire up the navigation so that when we click on one of the radio buttons, we're going to display different content in the application. So let's go into the code. We can easily right-click and view code. And what we want to do is add code to the radio button pane item underscore click method. And so that code is going to be this. We have one radio button. And what I did on each of these is I gave them each a tag. That's how we know what radio button to use. So rather than have a different event handler for every button, I just have one event handler for the entire set of buttons, and then I want to read the tag property. So if the tag is map, then I'm going to load the map page, which of course doesn't exist yet, so we'll need to create that. So the next thing we'll do is right-click on the project, and add new item, and we're going to add a blank page, and we're going to call it map page. Okay, and again, we'll collapse this and go into the XAML. I'm going to get rid of all of this because I have all of the XAML already written. So on the map page, we've got a stack panel with a checkbox to show traffic, a button to switch from aerial to road view, and a map control. And it looks like this. So here's where the map will be, and then we've got options for working with the map. We'll obviously need some code for this, so let's right-click and view code. And that code, of course, is also written, because you don't want to watch me type. Okay, so this code does some things when the map loads. We go to Seattle. We can turn traffic flow on and off. We can change the map style from aerial to road. And then when we tap on the map, we can see where we're at. Okay, let's run this application and see what it looks like now. Okay, when we click Map, here's the map. You get this warning here, map service token not specified. If you go to the Bing Maps API site and get a API token and put that in your code, then this warning would go away. But for our purposes here, this is fine. So here's a map of Seattle. We can see what the traffic's like. Not too bad this time of day. We can switch from road view to aerial and back and forth. Okay, this looks good. Now, we mentioned earlier that you get to build the app once and it runs anywhere Windows 10 will run. So let's see what it would look like on a different device. So I can come up to this drop down here, and rather than run it on the local machine or the simulator or a remote machine, I could run it on a device if I had one. I could also run it in one of the emulators. So I'm going to choose this mobile emulator, and I'll click this to run the application. Visual Studio launches the mobile emulator, and I already had it running earlier, so I didn't have to wait for it to start up. The emulator takes a little bit of time to start up and then copy the application over. So the second time you run it, it's a lot faster. So here's our application running on a phone. We can see what it looks like. Looks good. Let's click Map. And this tripped me up the first time I wrote this because I've clicked Map and I don't see the map. Well, it turns out that the navigation pane is covering the map. So if I close this, then we can see our map. We'll have to fix that. Once again, I can see traffic. I can switch from road to aerial and back. And the app looks good. Okay, let's come back into Visual Studio. Let's stop the application and let's make a couple changes. The first thing that we want to do is when we click the map in the navigation, we want to close the navigation pane. So we're going to come back into the main page's code. And right after we make a selection, right here, we're going to add some code to close the split view. That takes care of the first part. But the second thing we want to do is start working on the UI. I had mentioned earlier that even though you write the application and run it once, even though you write the application once and run it anywhere, what you need to do is adjust the UI based on the device. So we're going to do that with something called Adaptive UI, and we're going to use the Visual State Manager. So we're going to come into the main page XAML. And we want the split view to behave differently based on the width of the screen. So what we're going to do is in between the grid and the split view, we're going to add the following XAML. And we use the Visual State Manager, and we use state triggers, and we're going to say that if the width of the window is between 0 and 720, then the pane is not open, and we're going to change the display mode of the split view to overlay. When we hit 720 pixels, the pane is still closed, but we're going to use compact overlay. And when we get to 1024 pixels and above, the pane is open and the display mode changes to compact inline. Okay? So we're basically at runtime changing properties of the split view based on the size of the window. So let's see what this looks like. First, I'm going to run this locally, because we can test this locally. We can test what this looks like before we even run it on a device. Okay, and as we make this wider, when we get to 1024, the split view opens, the pane opens. If we go between 720 and 1024, it closes, and then when we get below 720, the icons disappear. Okay? Now, let's see what this looks like running on the device. Let's come back in here, and now go to the emulator again. click this and see what it looks like on the phone. Oh, there were deployment errors. Let's try it again. Still deployment errors. What did I do? Element not found. So let's clean the solution. Let's rebuild it. If this fails, we can uninstall it from the phone and see if that solves the problem. I don't think I made any errors in the code. Okay, that worked. So now, because we are constrained in terms of screen real estate, notice that the split view is completely closed because we're under 720. And then we can open this and go to the map view, and now our application's UI changes based on the screen real estate. It's actually not based on the device. We haven't created the phone version of the app and the desktop version of the app. The cool thing about these triggers and basing it on the size of the window is you're basing it on the screen real estate. Okay, we want to do something similar with the map page. Right now in the map page, the buttons show up on top, but what I want is for them to be on the right-hand side when the screen real estate is large enough, and up top when the screen real estate is smaller. Okay, so let's go into the map page, XAML. And the first thing I'm going to do is change the stack panel from a stack panel to a relative panel. I notice Visual Studio changes the closing tag when I change the opening tag. The relative panel gives you the ability to lay out controls relative to each other. And then what I'm going to do with the map control, rather than just hard code the height, what I'm going to do is set the location of the map control relative to the other controls. So I'm going to say that it aligns to the bottom of the panel and left with the panel, and it then takes up the rest of the screen. So now here's the map control. Okay, then the final thing we want to do here is add some adaptive UI as well. And we're going to say that in between 0 and 720, we want the map control to be below the search controls. And when we hit 720, the search controls go to the right of the map control. Okay? So again, let's test this out locally. And let's call up the map. The controls are to the right if the screen is wide enough, but when the screen gets smaller, these go on top. And let's run this in the emulator to see what it looks like on the phone. And by default, when we open up the map, because this is a fairly narrow screen, these controls appear in the top. So this shows you how you can write the application once and have it adjust UI-wise to the different devices and where you're going to run the application. So you'll spend a little bit of time designing the application. What should it look like on a narrow screen? What should it look like on a wider screen? What should it look like as the screen size changes? And that is how, in the universal Windows platform, you can write the application once, have it run anywhere, and automatically adjust. And that's the overview of how you build a Windows 10 application. Now, this is a quick start challenge, of course, and you want to get your points for that. So let's go see what you need to do. So you want to complete this on MVA, signed in with your Microsoft account. Join the Visual Studio Dev Essentials program. Download Visual Studio 2015, which we've already done. Create the application just as you did here. And then, when we run the application, you can click on anywhere in the map and it'll show you where you are. So for example, if we come back in here, let's do this locally. Run the application. And there's code in there to handle the tapped event. So if I click on the I-90, I can see where I'm at. So what we want you to do is make sure your name can be seen. So let's come in here, and in the map page.xaml, let's do this. Rather than map tapped, let's put in our tech rewards name, checked in. So have your name there, run the application, go to the map, click on I-90, and take a screenshot of this, post it to Twitter with the Tech Rewards tag, then visit the Tech Rewards challenge pane, sign in with the Microsoft account, and include the link to your screenshot in the comments, and then we can validate that and hit participate, and you'll get the credit.